Everyone thinks because you're a zombie, you don't know good coffee. Well, they're wrong. There's only one brew that gets my seal of approval. Deadly Grounds coffee is my guilty pleasure. The aroma is so intoxicating. It brings all of my neighbors out of the woodwork. Deadly Grounds coffee. Coffee to die for, and zombie approved. It's good to get a little deadly. Use the front door! Oh, they're so disgusting.
The Dorkening and all affiliated shows are not intended for anyone under the age of 18. The following may contain discussions or scenes that have adult situations, graphic violence, nudity, strong sexual content, and graphic language. This show is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised.
Greetings! Hey, everybody out there in watching land, usually listening land, greetings and welcome once again to a very special episode of the Retro Ridoctopus Cephala podcast. That's the only show, for those of you who might not know, that celebrates all the things that made growing up awesome. We are usually not a live stream, but we're trying it out today. And we are definitely always part of the Dorkening Podcast Network. And as always, brought to you by the aforementioned Deadly Grounds Coffee, coffee to die for. I am your host. My name is Parasite Steve, a.k.a. Steve Van Samson, a.k.a. Steve of Destruction, though nobody calls me that. And if you're wondering why Retro Ridoctopus is streaming live in the middle of a Sunday afternoon, or evening if you're in the UK, you're probably not alone. For those of you who don't know, while we're primarily a fun-loving nostalgia audio podcast, currently in our 6th season, we also have a sideshow known as The Brig. And The Brig is where we interview talented creative types like artists, filmmakers, and of course authors, because I happen to know a few of those. Now, as it happens, the live stream is this here bad boy right here. This live stream is actually our 50th episode of The Brig. Pretty crazy. So we've been doing the show for 6 years. This Brig sequence thing, whatever it is, we've been interviewing people for about 5 of those. So we kind of ramped up in later years. But yeah, this is number 50. So we're actually, it's kind of a big deal. We're pretty proud of it. And while they say you got to either go big or go home, since we're all broadcasting from inside our houses and apartments at this point, I'm kind of hoping we can do both. But before we get to our incredible lineup of guests, I want to shout out our very special crow host who flew in all the way from the Owl Light Network. Why, it's none other than Delphine. Delphine.
Hey.
How you doing?
Doing good. I'm super excited to be here. I'm getting to meet some very cool people. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. This is your first time actually on our show. I've been on your show a ton of times. And so this is great. And you're usually on splash pages and tons of shows. You're on a million. What are you on? You're on like a billion shows.
Yeah, we have 16 shows on the Owlite Network right now. I am not on all of them, but I do the Clutch of Personalities, which is my interview show that you've been on a lot. We do the Owlite Society, which is it's kind of a virtual campfire where we sit around and tell stories to each other, which you've also been on. Tomb of the Terrible, which is a bad movie review show that I go on. There's a ton of stuff that we're doing. We're watching Manos Hand of Fate for tomorrow night, and I'm just like, oh my God.
So the review show isn't bad. It's just that you review bad movies. I feel like that's an important distinction.
Yes. No, we have quite a following on it. It's rather weird. We did Sleepaway Camp 1 or 2. It is. The shows we watch are horrible, but that's why it's called Tomb of the Terrible.
Right.
So
very cool. Well, thank you for joining us today. I couldn't do this without you. I know you're going to be a huge help. And I kind of, asked you a little while ago. I'm like, I need some help. Oh, Obi-Wan. And you're like, it's okay. It's okay. I got you, man. I got you. So we appreciate, absolutely. I appreciate. And for those of you watching, Delphine will be lurking around and reading all of the comments from you guys on Facebook. So if you want to participate in the show and you have any questions for any of our amazing guests tonight, and we do have an absolutely insane lineup, just type them in and she'll take care of you, and they will be asked at the appropriate point of time and all that. So on to the business at hand, though. we are here to celebrate a book. Not just any book, the upcoming horror anthology, Fears, Tales of Psychological Horror. 21 stories of extreme psychological dread. In this uniquely unsettling anthology, editor Ellen Datlow has unearthed 21 exemplary tales of what humanity fears most. People. The book is up for pre-order right now on TachyonPublications.com, and it comes out on September 10th, 2024. And this afternoon, on this very weird live brig we're doing, that you are watching and or listening to right now, we have 4 incredible guests, 3 of Fear's contributing authors and the best-selling editor who put it all together. So before we get any further, let's do some intros. She's been called the venerable queen of horror anthologies by the New York Times, and with over 40 years in the business, it's not hard to see why. For years, she was the fiction editor of Omni magazine, but currently acquires short stories and novellas for Tor.com and Nightfire. And if that's not enough, because I'm not done, she also won multiple World Fantasy Awards, Locus Awards, Hugo Awards, Stoker Awards, and has edited more than 100 science fiction, fantasy, and horror anthologies, including her annual The Best Horror of the Year series. Ladies and gentlemen, and Retroids, big and small, please put your tentacles together for the great Ellen Datlow. Welcome to the show, Ellen. And I said your name right.
You did. Thank you.
Yes. All right. 5 minutes in and we haven't screwed up yet. So welcome. Thank you for being on our crazy little podcast we got here.
Pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
And I'm going to go right along and introduce everybody so everybody's beautiful faces can be on the screen as fast as humanly possible. So we got 3 readers, and the first is a pretty cool lady. Her fiction has appeared in over 40 anthologies and magazines and has been reprinted in multiple best of anthologies, including the Best Horror of the Year, Year's Best Weird Fiction, and the Mammoth Book of Best Erotica. Please welcome Livia Llewellyn.
Hi.
And I also didn't screw up your name, right?
Yes,
Llewellyn.
you did.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh man, I'm
Think
batting
it.
1,000.
Better if you don't overthink them.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. Well, it's like Llewellyn. I feel like people pronounce it both ways. Do they?
Just call me the Livia.
The Livia. Thank you for being here, the Livia. We are so happy to have you.
Happy to be here.
Our second reader is the Bram Stoker, Splatterpunk, and Shirley Jackson Award-nominated author of the novels Mountain Home, Stranded, Come to Dust, and Closing Costs. His short fiction has been collected in White Night and Other Ponds and 13 Views of the Suicide Woods. He also has a really boss Viking beard and happens to be my close personal friend, Bracken MacLeod. Oh my goodness. Bracken MacLeod with the arms. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. We're happy to have all of you, and you are the only one who I've actually hugged in person. So there.
Apologies for whatever damage I did to your ribs and or spine.
He thinks he's so much stronger than he is. I swear. Finally. This British author has been described as brilliant by The Guardian, among the most important writers of contemporary British horror by the great Ramsey Campbell. He is the author of 7 novels and 4 full-length short story collections and has been 4 times shortlisted for the British Fantasy Award, the venerable Simon Bestwick. Welcome, Simon.
Venerable, you cheeky bugger. Thanks, Steve. Hello.
Hello, everybody. So this is everybody, folks. Our amazing panel, all from the brand new book, Fears, Tales of Psychological Horror. So we're going to keep things kind of focused on this collection. As I said, it comes out in September, and we're very excited about it. So I think what we'll do is start out with a little conversation with Ellen, because you're kind of the reason everybody's here. Kind of a big deal. Ellen, over 100 anthologies. Like,
It doesn't feel like
my
that.
God.
Well,
My God.
most of them are year's bests, don't forget. I mean, I had 21, I think, of the year's best fantasy and horror, and then I've been doing, I'm up to 16. I'm working on number 17 of the best horror of the year. So that's
Yeah.
what 130. So almost half of those are best horror of the year anthologies.
Still, it's incredible. It's a lot of reading you have to do. I feel like you must. How do you do anything else?
I don't. I mean, that's what I'm doing most of the time. And in fact, I actually cleaned what you can't see it, but I have a cocktail table next to me that's filled with piles of books to read for the year's best. I try to move. They're not. Luckily, you can't see them. And also, I'm hoping that Jack, my cat, won't knock them over. I moved them far enough away, so hopefully, if he lies down on here, he won't be knocking them over. So yes, I read a lot.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's kind of hard to focus. You know, if I'm reading really good things, good stories, I have to stop in between. And for reading bad stories, I have to like refocus and just cleanse my brain. You know, so.
I mean, fair enough. And as you're reading these, I don't know how I'd love to know what your process is, because most of your anthologies, not counting the best of the year, most of your other anthologies are themed. So like with this one, Fears, it's all psychological horror. And obviously you have so many other ones. You have, the Lovecraft one. You have the When Things Get Dark, which was your Shirley Jackson, Stoker award-winning Shirley Jackson book from 2021. That was like your big tribute. You're like, okay, let's people write stories in her vibe kind of thing. But like when you're picking stories, like how do you is it sometimes that you'll read something and it'll put the idea in your head for like maybe this could be a theme for an anthology in the future or something like that? How do you come up with your ideas?
It depends. Sometimes a publisher does. Like the publisher and I actually came up with the Jackson idea at the same time, although they never knew it. I mean, I was at a ReaderCon and somehow it came up, hey, what would you like to do next? Oh, I'd love to do a book inspired by Shirley Jackson, but I never followed up on it. And then I met with some Titan editors at the WorldCon like a few months later. It must have been a month or two later. And we were trying to figure out, I'd love to do an anthology for you. What can I do? And we just threw ideas back and forth. And then they mentioned Shirley Jackson. And I never mentioned to them that I had actually thought of that one. So that was kind of a mutual thing. And others I come up with on my own. I tried to sell the doll collection for years because I collect weird dolls and doll parts. And I always wanted to do a doll anthology, but I couldn't figure out how to sell it. I never had a title. And so I had lunch with a friend, and she came up with this title, The Doll Collection. And that kind of brought the whole idea together, and I was able to get my agent to sell it. So different ways, different ideas. And with the reprint anthologies, I've done several with Tachyon. Fears is a Tachyon anthology. They only do reprint anthologies. They can't afford to do original ones. So I've come up with, with my publisher / editor, Jacob Weissman, we come up with themes that he thinks will sell. And they have to be broad enough. He wants them really broad. And I'm happy if I can figure out something really broad, because that way I can bring in all kinds of writers and all kinds of stories. So that's how they get started. I mean, the whole rest of it's a long process, Yeah, but the reprints, I actually contact. I mean, I may have some ideas of stories that I want to reprint someday that I really enjoyed and want to figure out how can I use this story. So sometimes an anthology, a reprint anthology comes together that way. It's like, I've always loved psychological horror. There's a story I want to reprint by Charles Birkin that was like from 1964. So, but he's dead. So, but most of the writers are alive. So, but I think what I try to do is I'll contact people, writers who I think write psychological horror or have written it or can write, have it in their backlist, and I'll contact them and say, do you have any psychological horror stories? Initially, I think I left it open for supernatural, but I got too many stories that were mostly supernatural. So I think on my later emails, I said it can't be supernatural.
Okay, so the rules are very specific with
when I'm doing
these.
an anthology, they're not that firm. They're firm, but they're not firm. I mean, like Lovecraft, I've done Lovecraft monsters, and yes, they had to be stories that had some Lovecraft a monster that Lovecraft created or a character. So yes, they're within the theme, but if I can justify, and this is for my for my original anthologies as well as my reprint anthologies, if I can justify it within my set to myself, I will take it. And I really love the story, I'll take it. I'll squeeze it in somehow, and then I'll retrofit it, and then tell people, oh yeah, sure it is. Here it's this, you know. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes, I mean, there's a lot of anthologies. I'm speaking more broadly, not just yours, but there's a lot of anthologies that I've, read stories in that I'm kind of, at the beginning of the story, I'm like, well, maybe this doesn't fit. Like, I'm not sure why this was included. And then, the theme sort of presents itself later, and you're like, okay, this isn't like as on the nose as some of the other ones, but like, there's a reason it was chosen. There's a reason it's here. And so, yeah, I mean, that's why you do what you do. I mean,
well, also you can kind of squeeze in maybe one that doesn't quite fit, and usually no one notices. If it's a good story, they'll just like it. And then maybe after the fact, they'll realize, hey, how did that fit in the theme? It's like, oh, I don't care, I really liked it. And you can do that with all kinds of anthologies, actually.
Right.
But you can't do more than one like that. I mean, one story within.
Right. It's interesting, like you gave kind of two examples of how you would start something just in that answer. You talked about the dolls, and dolls is something that you personally are interested in. So, that's one way of starting. We'll say like, well, I don't know if this is going to be broad enough to sell to this specific publisher, but I love dolls. I'd love to do a doll anthology. And it's certainly a strong enough, theme that you could see enough other authors like digging in and being like, yeah, okay, creepy dolls. Yeah, we can do that.
We even did a creepy doll. We did a doll party. George R.R. Martin owns a movie theater in Santa Fe, and several of my writers came out, and we had an ugly doll, I can't remember if it was a creepy doll or ugly. I think it was a creepy doll party, and people made creepy dolls.
Nice.
Creepy dolls. It was a lot of fun.
That is a lot of fun. That's really great. But and then you said, oh well, sometimes it's a story sparks it, and you wanted to reprint that one story from the 60s. So I mean, that's very interesting. I think it's really cool, and for me as a fan of anthologies and of short story collections, I always prefer when there is a theme. And I heard you say in another interview that you do almost no non-themed anthologies. Is that because they are less desirable to the publishers, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Publishers always say they don't want non-theme anthologies. They don't sell very well. I mean, I've done several. The ones I've done that are non-theme, Fearful Symmetries did okay. I mean, it was a Kickstarter and actually earned out, and it's done okay. But other non-themed anthologies I've done, like Salon Fantastique, which is a fantasy anthology that Terry Winling and I edited, it didn't sell very well, even though we thought it was a really good anthology. The Del Rey book of science fiction, horror, and fantasy didn't sell. That was it was a non-themed anthology. So I mean, I love non-themed anthologies. I love editing them, but it's really a hard sell, because even though readers say, oh, why do you always do theme anthologies? Why don't you do non-themed? But they don't buy them.
Yeah.
Well, not enough buy them to make it make it work. That's why.
So let's talk about Fears. Psychological horror. You said it was interesting to you. What is it about the topic? What is it about the genre that you liked enough to dedicate? I assume, I don't know, a couple years of your life to the.
That's it. With any anthology, I have to be interested in the theme enough to spend 2 years with it. So yes. Well, psychological horror is just one aspect of one subgenre of horror. I mean, there are science fiction horror is another one. Conte Cruel is another. Terror fiction, if you want to just divide that out from horror. So I mean, I've loved psychological horror stories. I mean, I may not have defined them as that until after the fact, but and it was also coming together with Jacob, my editor, my publisher, who thought it was a good. I don't remember what I initially came up with, but we decided that the psychological horror was broad enough to encompass a lot of different stories that I knew that I solicit reprints. But I love it. I mean, it's interesting because yes, man's inhumanity to man. It doesn't have to be a supernatural thing to create dread and horror.
Yeah, and like you said, you may not have always used that term. I never really used that term, but like thinking about it, it's what I would always say is like terror. Just being in the moment of, what is the mind doing? And I think that's a very Lovecraftian thing. And, it's just, how is our psyche dealing with the pressures of what's going on around us? And I think really great.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's true to life. It's more likely, psychological horrific things are more likely to happen to us than supernatural things, unless you believe in the supernatural. So in a way, it's closer to the bone.
True.
For everybody's fears. It's like, I did not mean to do that, but yes.
well said. All right. Well, I think we can get on to some readings if you guys want to do that, because we have 3 of the contributing authors here, as you know. And for those of you just joining us, we're going to do everybody is going to read an excerpt from their story in Fears, and we'll chat with each author one at a time. They'll do their excerpt. And before moving on to the next author, I thought it would be kind of fun to check back with Ellen each time to get her reaction to the story. And I'm going to put you on the spot and really be like, okay, but why did you love this? And my hope is that we can, kind of rub some egos along the way and make everybody feel good.
Before we start, I just want to say something before we start. I really need to mention that I quote Bracken in my introduction, because we had a discussion about this. So that might have been partly why the whole thing came about, because at Storyfest, I think it was a few years ago, we had a discussion about psychological horror and dread and terror.
Oh, dread,
yeah. It was a dread. It's a feeling of dread. And anyway,
Yes.
That's in my intro, and I thank him. I quote him.
Thanks, Bracken. Turns out we're actually only here because of you.
Sometimes I say things that are worth being said. It's rare, but it happens.
And don't forget, guys, if you have any questions along the way, please ask them in the chat. And Delphine will be monitoring that and posting them at the appropriate time once each story is finished. So everybody ready? Sound good? Good?
Yeah.
Okay. So first up, Livia.
I like the way that sounds, actually.
The Livia. Tell us about your writing in general. What kind of stuff what do you do?
Well, my writing in general is largely horror, superstition, not psychological horror, a little bit of weird horror, very Lovecraftian in nature, and very grounded in specific places, mainly places where I've lived, the Pacific Northwest, the East Coast, the big city. And I'm also known for the naughty bits, the erotica, the horror that also has a lot of sexuality in it. Doesn't have to be Lovecraftian. It's just sexual in nature or sexual encounters. Body horror that turns out good or bad or just weird. So yeah, that's what I'm known for.
Does body horror ever turn out good?
Well,
nobody wants to be a cockroach, right?
I have written a couple of stories where the protagonists, I always write about women. That's just who I am. It's what I do. It's my jam. But because I'm a woman, a lot of my life has centered around my body being seen as horror or as an other, unmanageable, unruly, needs to be controlled. And so a lot of my body horror ends up with the protagonists kind of accepting it or being empowered by these changes, whatever they are. What may seem monstrous to the reader is actually a moment of like evolution for the protagonist. So, and I never go into a story saying I've got a message. It's sometimes the protagonist just says, hey, this isn't the way it's going. We're doing something else with this. So yeah.
Just feeling it out and letting your characters just, take you there.
Yeah. Sometimes, they take me to a place I didn't intend to go, and they're like, "Hey, no, this is cool. I like having 20 hands. It's fine, and 3 extra heads."
It's so funny. Like that is, the adage of authors saying that their characters, they listen to their characters. Their characters really write the story. They don't write the story. I'm always convinced that is like probably sounds like the most arrogant bullshit to anyone who's not a writer. And yet it is the case though. Like it just is the case. It's like if you can, and I always tell people that like, I think if you're able to do that as an author, if you can hear your characters, or conversely, if you want them to go in a different direction that you planned for originally, you're like, I want them to go over here. And when you get to that point and they get to the fork in the road, you're like, oh, they would never take that way. Like they're going to go left, not right. And if you can do that, it's like, well, to me, that means that you were able to write strong characters. They can actually talk to you. Like that's...
I do believe that there's like this subconscious level where we've already got the story figured out. It's already in there. It's just that, you're sitting down at the computer, you've got your music on, you've got your favorite beverage, you've got you think you've got your ending, or you do have your ending. You just don't know all the roads it's going to take. And you make assumptions, but there's something inside saying, no, this is the way to go. So it's not that I'm going, oh, my character did this to me. It's damn it. Well, okay.
Right.
I fucked it up. It's more like I kind of got my own bullshit out of the way.
Yeah.
and I found exactly what it was supposed to be.
Nice.
Yeah.
So let's talk psychological horror. Is this a genre you're drawn to in general?
Well, I do read a lot of psychological horror. I do read a lot of thrillers and literary fiction. That's very dark. I've always been attracted to that in movies and TV shows. I just never did that in my fiction. There was always something supernatural and inexplainable and otherworldly going on. But how I started writing this story was many years ago. Joyce Carol Oates emailed me and said, I'm putting together an anthology of noir, and I'd like you to write something. And you don't say no to Joyce Carol Oates. I was thrilled and flattered, and I was also scared to death because I didn't know that I could do it. But we emailed each other back and forth. She was a very good teacher in kind of leading me to a place where I could stop second guessing myself and get out of my way and actually write the story. And I ended up using all of the themes that I usually use in my fiction. It's just that in this case, the monster was something mental and emotional inside the protagonist, and not something supernatural. And it worked out really well. It's actually one of my favorite stories, and I would like very much to do something else that's like non-supernatural based. I just haven't quite figured out yet, but yeah. So
isn't it just the best when anybody pushes you out of your comfort zone and you don't want to go, and you're like, no, I don't want to do this, and you do it, and this is one of your favorite stories now.
Yeah,
So
it's happened a number of times, and it's always a surprise because afterwards I'm always like, oh, well, that's not going to happen again because now I've totally figured it all out. And and then, a couple years later, I'm like, I can't write this story. And the editor's like, yeah, you can. You're just fucking it up. So like do it differently.
Stop fucking it up.
Yeah, and then you're like, oh, okay.
So your story in Fears is called One of Those Nights. Can you give us just a little bit of background on what it's about and like how you came to write it? And then anytime you want, you can take us into your reading.
It's actually called One of These Nights, and
Oh.
yes, it is the title of the Eagles song, which was a big kind of motivator for me in writing it. Very dark and kind of menacing, and that's what this story is about. It's about two young women who've been lifelong friends, and they're meeting at this suburban pool in Tacoma, which I used to do as a young girl. And there was this big pool, and this is based a lot on what I did growing up. There'd be swimming lessons every summer. It was horrible. I hated it. I'm not a swimmer. I'm a reader. That's what I do during the summers. I read and play with Barbies. I don't swim, but my mother made me do that. And always hated it. So this is kind of like a little bit of revenge, getting back. And that's basically what the story is about too. It's about revenge, and it's about getting back, and about young women kind of empowering themselves to and allowing themselves to be horrible in a way that you wouldn't. I mean, some people are like, oh yeah, young kids, like they do the worst things, but this kind of takes it like one step beyond.
Okay.
And I just wanted to explore that kind of period of my life when I was like frog march to the swimming pool every single day, every summer, Yeah.
Right. Walking like Charlie Brown with his head down,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Just very.
Right. Exactly. All right. Well, it sounds great. Whenever you're ready, take us into your excerpt.
All right. One of These Nights. I'm just reading a short portion of the first part of the story. Nicole's father doesn't say a word when he drops us off at Titlow Park, and that's fine with me. Mr. Miller's car is hard and lean and long, with dents all along the side and a giant rusty grill in the front that looks like a monster's grin. His car looks like the kind that would roll down the streets at night all by itself, latching onto you with its lidless glass eyes and running you down like the neighbor's mangy dog, backing up over and over again until there was nothing left but a sticky red smear on the black top. His car reminds me of him. Time to get wet, Nicole says. I peel myself off the sticky leather and lurch out of the car and into the piercing summer sun and noise, the sounds of 100 kids shrieking and thrashing in the park's Olympic-sized pool like they're all being murdered. From the other side, Nicole unfurls into the humid air, all long, tanned limbs and bikini-top ties, the tip of her black, wet curls against her neck from the heat and sweat and coconut oil, from secretions of adulthood that still haven't settled over me yet. I don't understand how she can look so old when we're both 15. I'm not exactly a kid myself, but the way she's moving forward, I'll never catch up. Then again, I don't have a father like hers to get me there. I have to do everything myself. Can I have $1 for the vending machine, Daddy? Nicole asks, swaying her body back and forth as if she's still 5. She lets the last word drawl and drip out of her mouth, just like I've heard her mother do when she's drunk and itching for a fight. Ask your little friend Julie. I already gave her all my spare change. Nicole's fake smart-ass smile vanishes. Some other type of smile takes its place, and it's real. I know, she says. Mr. Miller sneers at her, then flicks his cigarette ash out the window. You know nothing. Soft gray flecks drift onto Nicole's face. You know what's going to happen, don't you? Mr. Miller shrugs. Do you gotta do, daughter. You know you want to. Come on. I tug at Nicole's arm, then touch her tote bag, so heavy it doesn't sway. She looks at me, then stares back at him with those same pale green-gray eyes that are in his worn fox-sharp face. After a second, she slowly walks away. I hook my thumb in the belt loop of my shorts and lean forward slightly, my face hovering just outside the window. He can see right down my top. I give him my most earnest, respectful gaze. How about that $1, Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller smiles at me, a wide grin that makes his lips curl up like he's pretending he isn't smelling something bad. Is that all you want from me, honey? He says, plucking the cigarette out of his mouth. Because Julie asked for more than that, and I gave it to her. I can give you some too. I lean in closer. Right here, Mr. Miller? You can't wait? Can you? He drapes his hand out of the car window, and his thick fingers hang in the air, moving back and forth in front of my breasts as more ash floats from the red tip. A few flecks catch against my skin. He's waiting for me to say it, beckoning it out of me with those rough hands. A soft pop escapes my lips as they part. But nothing else comes out of me. All my thoughts have gone fuzzy red, and suddenly, like thunder, the car is rolling across the blacktop, so fast and loud that I jump back in fright. He's gone just like that, out on the road and leaving me behind in a shimmering sea of cars, mothers snarling and tut-tutting at me as they rush their kids past. I don't know why they're glaring at me. I don't control what he does. Most of the time. I make my way across the lot over to the low building. Paint bubbles and peels off its concrete sides in fading aqua strips, and grime streaks the glass double doors. Above the entrance, fading brass letters read Titlow Park Pool, but it's clear that some of the letters have been vandalized and replaced multiple times. Low is spelled with much shinier metal, making the tit that much more noticeable. Like everything in Tacoma, I'd seen better times. I like it this way. Julie Westhoff hangs outside the doors, staring at her reflection in the filthy glass as she sprays something on her long pink tongue. Julie thinks she's more Nicole's friend than mine. Even though I knew Nicole first, Julie quickly took her place as the favorite and treats me as the interloper with the quiet confidence of girls who always look like her. Thin and blonde and pretty, always wearing low-cut blouses and halter tops with open spaces that travel down forever. So cool. She's not even a cheerleader. Instead, standing on the sidelines at pep rallies and games, making all the other girls lose their shit as she leans against the railing and slowly plays with her hair. She's the kind of girl Nicole and I used to wish we could look and act like. Above it all, never letting anything get under her skin. It took us a weird while to realize there's a world of difference between looking that way and being that way. And we had it going on long before she came along. Where's Nicole, I ask. Somewhere, I don't know. She disappeared around the corner. She's pissed at me or life. I don't know. Julie lets out a small, satisfied sigh as she inspects her face. It always makes her a little smug when she thinks we're miserable. Is this about her father? Did you and he... I let my voice trail off. Julie's eyes narrow. What the fuck are you talking about? I don't even know him. She looks down at her hand at the small cylinder rolling between her fingers. Really, I say. Really. Her voice is turned steely, meaning the conversation is over. We follow a group of parents and their kids through the door. I can't help but frown at the familiar nauseating smell of chlorine. We haven't even gotten to the dressing rooms yet, and already it clogs my lungs, slowing my movements and weighing me down. It's the smell of my childhood, of graceless flailing, of choking, of always fighting the sensation of sinking into oblivion. Back in '68, the year I turned 5, some Tacoma chick won 3 medals in swimming at the Olympics. By the next summer, every mother in the city was dragging her daughter here for her lessons, and every summer after that was spent struggling in the lanes of the competition-sized pool, swallowing great gulps of warm chemical water as we thrashed our way through the 4-hour sessions like dying cats. Every summer, at least one kid drowned or got sent to the hospital, and they still kept pushing us into the bright blue water, hoping for one more girl who'd bring home the gold. Mom finally stopped taking me when I got my first period and threw a huge shit fit about wearing a bathing suit with a big old brick of wet cotton between my legs. But I think she was tired of driving all the time, and I was never a good swimmer anyway. Nicole was the good one. All I learned how to do was hold my breath underwater until the instructors forgot about me or left me alone. It's been a little over a year since I've been here. Nothing's changed. Well, a few things have. We pay our entrance fees, then make our way into the women's changing room, echoing with high voices and laughter, the slap of bare feet and shower water against tile, the metallic bang of locker doors. It smells the way it always has, like perfume and soap and damp crotch, but the room seems smaller and dingier than I remember. And so many girls look so much younger. As we strip out of our clothes, I catch a girl I recognize from the 7th grade class staring at me. Then some kid on the bench beside her giving me the eye, super young, maybe 10. I realize with a slight start that I've become the unsettling older creature the younger me always wanted to be. The kid's eyes are round and startled as she stares at our naked bodies, at our breasts and the dark hair between our legs. That's how I used to look at the older girls when I was a kid. Those are women, I would think to myself. I'm going to be one of them someday. Now, I am. That's it.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
To be continued in the book, Fears.
Yes. Tales of Psychological Horror.
Yeah.
Out this fall from Tachyon Publications. It's great stuff. So here's where, like, if anybody wants to say anything,
Any thoughts?
yeah, Ellen.
I can't believe you think that's your first psychological horror story, but I'm so glad that you have it.
Well, I guess I mean, there are elements of psychological horror, but this is the first one that I think I've written that didn't have any elements of superstition. Like the monster, the villain isn't a ghost. It's not a vampire. It's not a Godzilla. It's not something with tentacles, you know.
But it covers so many of your natural themes.
It does. You know, young woman on the cusp of young adulthood and bodies changing.
And also, although it's not mentioned yet, except subtly, predators.
Yeah, predatory relationships between adults and children, especially between men and young women, and women themselves becoming predators in retaliation, and the themes of summer and suburbia and the 70s, you know, my jam.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great stuff. Well, you know, Simon, did you have something you wanted to say? I know we're having a little bit of a lag with you over in the UK.
I'll be going to reading the rest of the story when I get my hands on the book.
Heck yeah.
I read it. I love it.
Yay.
Good job.
Thank you.
Delphine did her homework. She read all y'all stories.
Excellent.
All y'all stories. So up next, Bracken MacLeod. Bracken. Horns up, buddy. There we go. Would you please tell us about your writing just in general?
I'm a cross-genre writer, so I've done a lot of different things. Not everything, but I started out writing crime, and I actually kind of think of myself as an accidental horror writer because I started out writing crime, and a couple of people asked me if I would come play in their sandbox for an anthology or whatnot and do a horror story, and it turned out that I really loved doing it and wasn't terrible. So I started doing a little bit of both, and my crime writing has fallen off because I actually enjoy writing horror a lot more. And it's not a difference in the quality of the genre. It's a difference in how much joy I take out of the process of writing it. So I've done crime horror, some psychological suspense. I've done naturalistic. My latest book, Closing Costs, I feel like is, the publisher put a novel of suspense on the cover, but I feel like it's a horror novel in the same vein that Jack Ketchum's books were horror novels. Very naturalistic, very rooted in sort of the present and not in other places, supernatural spaces and that.
But it's about evoking that visceral fear.
Exactly. Yeah. No. It was an interesting book to write because I had done this other book which was a science fiction horror novel that was set in the Arctic, and I had to do a ton of research for it because I didn't know anything about the oil industry, about Arctic ecology, about maritime shipping. I thought, well, the next novel I write, I don't want to do a ton of research. I want to have it very, grounded. And so I set it in my own basement with the main characters, not one-to-one, but sort of loosely based on my wife and I. And it turned out that it was a much, much harder novel to write because it was so personal. It was hard to turn off. You spend 6-8 hours a day writing and thinking of the worst possible thing that could happen in your own life. And then my wife comes home from work and we have a cocktail and I'm just supposed to shut it off, but it's still in my head. Yeah. It didn't help that I some of the research that I did was, she's tied to a chair in the basement. Could she move that chair over to the wine rack? And so I'd go down to the basement.
And you're like, honey, can we just try something real quick?
A chair and try to scoot over to the wine rack to see if it was possible. So yeah, it was a full immersive experience in the way that writing about sailors in the Arctic wasn't.
And of course, that book is Stranded, which is a great book. And I remember one of the first conversations we had in person. I asked you about the research to Stranded because I was like, "How the hell do you know? Did you work on one of these rigs? Like, how do you know all this?"
It was hard to do because there's lots of material out there about the North Sea's fishing industry, TV shows and books and all of this stuff. But the oil industry is real tight-lipped about it. And so finding out what life is like on an oil rig is actually a little bit more difficult. I was lucky to stumble across a couple of people's blogs and that about their experiences doing that. So yeah, it was a lot of. It's funny because when we sold the book, they were like, "Can you?" And I'm like, "Of course I can." Write a book. Set on a boat about sailors and all of this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah, I can. Oh, by the way, thank you, Livia, for breaking the F-bomb barrier early in the show so that I can be free in my speech.
My pleasure. My fucking pleasure.
I'm like, fuck yeah, I can. Let's go. And then I sit down to write the book, and I realize I don't know the first thing about any of this stuff. So yeah, it was a crash course. But I feel like I did it all right. I haven't gotten hate mail from people who actually worked in that industry telling me how badly I got it all wrong.
Well, that's good. As somebody who knows nothing, it seems just 100% so incredibly genuine. And I think that's really one of my favorite things in stories is if there is something that I know nothing about that makes me feel that way, that I'm like, wow, this is literally like all of it's interesting on like all the levels. There's a whole other layer to this onion that like, oh, I'm also learning what it's like to be on an oil rig, and it's just really cool.
I had the benefit of family members who were career Navy. My uncle was the commander of the naval shipyards in Philadelphia, and his wife, my aunt, was one of the first women on board a vessel, back in the 70s. And they were able to inform me a lot about what day-to-day ship life is like, even if it wasn't commercial.
Right.
You're just kind of constantly fighting against the elements, trying to prevent rust. And an interesting fact I found out was that pretty much every day on board a ship there's a fire. And
wow.
They're not nice fires. It's not like structure, always oil and machinery and just noxious off.
It's not a cozy fire. You're not.
Cozy, So yeah, so
interesting.
I had that, which was really good.
And I, next question is, whether or not you're drawn to psychological horror. I would say that you always deal with psychological horror, and I would say that's one of your big hallmarks, big themes always.
That's really where I live. I'm a big plotter. So Livia was talking earlier about about the characters helping you, find your way through the story. I know my way through the story. I have a roadmap. I have a huge outline that goes from point A to point B, and I know exactly where all of the stops in between are. And what that allows me to do is it frees me up to explore the emotional moments in the story. If I know where they're going next, I don't have to worry about what happens. All I have to worry about is how do they feel about it. Right. And almost always in my stories, it's they feel really fucking bad about it.
You're a plotter, not a pantser, and you are a torturer as well.
And I'm a torturer, yeah. No, Paul Tremblay and I like to. Paul McCartney told me I should never drop names, but Paul Tremblay and we like to call bummer fiction writers, So
yeah,
deep sads.
Sometimes I drop your name, like casually.
Yeah. Well.
Nobody knows you.
No, I was saying, what good does it do you?
It's never worked. You
got a podcast,
So tell me about your story in Fears. It's called Backseat. And tell us a little bit about it and how you came to write this gem.
Backseat was an interesting story because I'm terminally online. I was doom scrolling, and I came across one of my friend's posts about how in the middle of the night somebody had broken into his car and stolen a roll of quarters that he had in there for the meters, And the reason he was commenting on it was because he had noticed two sets of footprints in the snow. One adult-sized and one child-sized, and all of the commenters in his post were kind of going hard on how terrible it is and what terrible parenting and that child should be taken away and all this stuff, and I felt like that was really reactionary, and I wanted to know what these two people really were like, and so I sat down to write this story, and this is my imagining of my friend's car being broken into.
I love that. Whenever you're ready, man.
All right, let's go. Yeah. Unlike Livia, I'm gonna read from paper, although it's not the actual. It's the first book that was published in. So my apologies, Ellen, for not having the right cover on my book.
Don't look at it.
Backseat. The cold made her feet hurt. She was wearing the same sneakers she'd had since the beginning of the school year, even though her feet had grown and her toes were pushing up against the ends. They were thin canvas and the flat soles were slippery on the black ice coating the road, but they were what she had. To combat the cold, she doubled up on socks, even though that made the shoes feel even smaller and crunched up her toes more. Layering her socks worked at first, but the cold still crept in like needles slowly being pushed through the canvas and into the layers of cotton underneath. There was snow on the ground on the side of the road, but it wasn't deep, not like the year before. She didn't have to slog through it like then. This was that dry, powdery kind that you couldn't make a snowman or even a ball out of. It just sifted through your fingers like weightless sand when you tried to shape it. It was the kind of snow that fell when it was so cold. The condensation from her dad's breath froze tiny icicles in his mustache and beard. When that happened, she used to laugh and try to pick the little pieces of ice out of his facial hair. He'd smile and bat her hands away, telling her to keep her paws off his beard diamonds. But the novelty of it wore off after the second week of record low temperatures, and neither of them acknowledged the tiny icicles anymore. They were headed into the second month of frigid temps now. That's what they said on the radio. Record lows not felt in New England in a century. At 9 years old, a century was a mythical length of time. Like once upon a time, happily ever after. 100 years only existed in stories. Though plenty of things in New England were much older, she'd never met a person who'd lived 100 years. She knew she wouldn't be around in a century to tell anyone how numb her toes were. Cold wasn't supposed to last like that. They walked along the side of the road toward the next house. She didn't want to leave tracks, but the ice on the road was too slippery to walk on. She had fallen a couple of times when they first got out of the car, and her dad told her it was okay for them to walk in the snow on the shoulder. That was tricky because it was dark and there were no streetlights out here to illuminate something in the shallow snow that might trip them. Just a faint, unsettling glow from the reflection of the moon behind the clouds. Hidden routes or not, if anyone came driving along, neither of them wanted to be in the road. The snow crunched softly beneath her feet. Her dad's footfalls were louder, though he did his best to stay quiet. He couldn't help his size. He walked in front of her and she tried to step in his footsteps. Though the snow wasn't deep, it still got in over the tops of her shoes and froze her ankles along with her stinging toes. Walking in his tracks kept that from happening as much, though it still did. She made a game of it, pretending she was a ghost stalking him, walking in his tracks, so when he looked behind, he couldn't see where she'd been. She'd stand in his footsteps and he'd see right through her and shiver at the thought that something was following him. What could it be? The spirit of a tragically lost girl he once knew? She thought it might be fun to be a ghost. Then she could sneak into some of these houses, pass right through the doors and walls, and sleep in an empty room all by herself, instead of in a car. The shelters in the city wouldn't take them. A single man with a child was bad enough, but they definitely wouldn't take a single man with a girl. Men and women were kept apart for safety reasons, they said. Her dad argued that she was his daughter, and they said it was policy. She couldn't stay in the men's area, and he couldn't go in the women's. We're sorry, they told them. So they had to sleep in the car. Her dad turned on the engine every couple of hours to run the heater. The sound of it turning over woke her up every time, but she pretended to sleep through the noise. She knew he wanted her to get good sleep so she could be alert in school. But then every few nights they had to go for the walk. She moved quietly behind him, pretending to be his spirit, until they reached a driveway and he turned to remind her with a raised finger to be extra quiet. She didn't need to remind him. She knew. Stepping around her dad, she glanced at the mailbox as if it mattered whose address this was. Most people bought those brass-colored metal numbers to stick on the side of their mailboxes, but this one had been carefully hand-painted. It was hard to read in the dark, but up close she could see. The person who'd done it hadn't painted the street name, just the numbers 5 and 7. That was enough. She remembered that they were on Summer Street. That made her smile at first. It was nothing like summer out that night, but it was nice to think about warm weather. She was ready for some. Her father leaned down and whispered in her ear. She wanted to pull back her stocking cap to hear him better, but her ears were as cold as her feet. They hurt in the biting wind, so she leaned closer and turned her head, but left the hat in place. You know the drill. Don't forget the cup holders. She nodded. She never forgot. Though when she came back without anything in hand, he worried that she wasn't looking hard enough. She tried to find what he wanted everywhere she could think of. Sometimes she even checked under the floor mats and the footwells. She crept up the driveway. It was clear of snow, though there was some salt spread out. She tried not to crunch when she stepped, but couldn't help it. She was small, and the noise was slight. Still, it sounded loud to her. At this time of night, every house on the street was dark. Everyone was asleep. She knew how tiny little sounds outside of her car made her wake up all night long. She tried to move as silently as a ghost. She hesitated beside the car and looked back at her dad. He'd melted into the shadows of the trees beside the driveway. The shadow he'd become nodded at her, and she turned back to the passenger door and pulled up on the handle, gritting her teeth, waiting for the electronic chirp that would tell her to let go and run for the shadows. The door clicked faintly and popped out an inch. No alarm. She shifted and pulled hard, and it swung open, and that's why they were in the town they were instead of Manchester or Concord. No one out here locked their doors. She jumped inside and pulled the door shut to extinguish the dome light overhead. It was still cold with the door closed, but the breeze couldn't get any more. She wished she had the keys so she could start the engine and let it idle for a little bit and heat up, take some of the chill out of her feet and hands. That was a sure way of getting caught as leaving the dome light on or just standing out on the front step and ringing the doorbell. No, she had to wait. The drive back to Manchester would be warm. She'd snuggle up under her blanket and get some sleep when they were through. And tomorrow was Saturday, no school. She could sleep in, though she never did. She opened the center console, knowing she probably wouldn't find any quarters in the coin slots, but still hopeful for something. No one out here locked their doors, but they didn't need meter money either. Free street parking in small towns meant no one kept quarters in their cars. The best she ever seemed to find was what someone got handed back in change from the drive-through window, along with their Whopper and Coke. That ended up in the cup holders most often, as her dad reminded her. But she checked everywhere. Her mouth watered at the thought of a hamburger. She loved Whoppers so much. They were better than a Big Mac or those dry square burgers from the other place with the girl on the sign. She gasped when she saw the roll of quarters wrapped in one of those paper bank sleeves in the console. $10! Whoever drove this car must go to the city a lot. Maybe even Boston if he needed that much change. She'd never found a whole roll of change before. Her heart started to beat fast with excitement. Dad would be so happy. Maybe he'd even let them quit early tonight. They could be out for hours on any other night before she found as much. She tried to imagine what his face would look like when she showed him, how the crinkles at the corners of his eyes would deepen and that one eyebrow would arch up the way it did. She loved that eyebrow. It only went up when he really smiled. It was how she could tell when he was faking. Still, there was more looking to do before she could go back to him with her treasure. She stuffed the coin roll in her pocket, closed the console, and started feeling around in the cup holders. Nothing, as if she hadn't found enough. She popped open the jockey box and felt around inside. Once she'd found a checkbook and had taken it back to her dad. He'd gotten excited at first, and then his face fell, and he told her they couldn't keep it. He didn't say why. He just said he couldn't write bad checks. She didn't know what made them bad. If they were filled out, they were good, right? Still, he'd thrown the checkbook in the garbage and told her to focus on cash and anything they might be able to pawn. Once she found a toy. Nothing big, just a tiny fashion doll of a blue-skinned girl with bright pink hair. Had little removable bracelets and a belt that she was careful not to lose, and the blue girl was beautiful even though she had little fangs. She knew it was a Monster High figure, though she didn't know the character's name. She'd hidden that find from her dad. She didn't want him to accuse her of having bad toys and throw that in the garbage can. When he found it in their car a week later, he'd asked where she got such a thing, and she lied to him and said that her friend at school, Holly, had given it to her. She was ashamed to lie, but it wasn't a bad toy. It was a good toy, and she wanted to keep it. The kid she took it from had a big house, and her parents drove a big SUV, and she didn't even care enough about the figure not to leave it on the floor in the back seat like an empty wrapper. She loved that monster girl better than the other kid had. There was a book in the jockey box. Who kept books in a place like that? She wondered. It was some grown-up book with a pair of bare feet on the cover. She thought for a minute about taking that, too, and giving it to her dad. She didn't know whether he liked books, but maybe it was like the figure, something he could love better than whoever had left it in the car. Sometimes they went to the library, and she sat and read while he looked at his email on the public computers. He never checked anything out. He never had time to read, he said. This book, though, stuffed in with the car papers like it wasn't anything important, could be his, and he could read it and not worry about it being due or late fees or anything. He could take all year to finish it if he wanted, and he could love it like she loved her blue girl. It was probably a bad book, like a bad check. He'd throw it away, and then no one would have it. She put the paperback novel with its one-word title back and closed the jockey box. Her dad would be getting impatient soon. He didn't like her to take too long. She had to hurry. She checked the floors under the mats and stuffed her fingers deep in the cracks in the seats, but she knew the quarter roll was all she was going to find. It was enough. Still, she turned to crawl into the back seat and look for other treasures. The boy sitting there stared at her from the shadows. A shout she couldn't control escaped her lips. She clapped her hands to her mouth, lurched away from the boy, hitting her back against the gear shift and then the dashboard. Another cry escaped her lips at a sudden insult of the little knobs that jutted out of the dash, jabbing into her back between her shoulder blades. If she'd been in the driver's seat, she would have honked the horn and they'd be caught. She arched her back and her foot slipped. She fell face first into the passenger seat, dragging her cheek down the cold leather. The quarter roll in her pocket pulled heavily like a weight, but didn't fall out. She whimpered at the pain of her neck craning back against the upright seat back as she pushed up. The side of her right leg hurt where it scraped against the plastic of the center divider. She wanted to cry and call out for her dad, but she had to keep herself together, at least until they got back to their own car. She sniffled and gritted her teeth and got back up on her knees. Peeking over the back of the seat in the dark, it looked like a doll, pale and still and small, and for a single second, an unwelcome thought about how much she'd love to have a baby doll intruded in her mind. But this wasn't a toy, it was a boy. He sat in his car seat, the harness over his shoulders, holding him upright, head tilted to the side on a thin neck. His skin wasn't like a piece of plastic painted to look like a real kid. It was pale in the moonlight and looked unreal. His eyes were open, but they were dull and unfocused, not like sharp plastic eyes that looked alert and had bright irises. His eyes weren't any of those things. He had on mittens and a snowsuit with little built-in booties, and she didn't want to know what his tiny fingers and toes looked like. She didn't want to know anything. Tears blurred her eyes as she struggled not to scream, but the boy, the tears in her eyes made him waver in the dark, and it looked like he might be wriggling against the straps of the car seat, trying to get free, trying to reach for her and close his tiny little fingers around her throat and squeeze. Once she'd seen part of an old movie about dead people coming back to life, and they were horrible blue color that made her laugh because it was so fake looking, and how could anyone be scared by a blue person? And then they bit people, and the crazy extra red blood squirted out, and she got scared. Even though that was fake looking too, like a living cartoon, it was terrifying because it was blood. Nobody lost that much blood and stayed alive. In the diffused moonlight, this boy was blue like that. The thought of him biting her and crazy bright blood spurting out of her body into his round baby face made her breath hitch, and she pushed away from the seat back. The boy didn't move. He didn't look up or cry or even breathe. He sat there in the dark and looked somewhere 1,000,000 miles away, maybe in a whole different world, looking at her from the ghost world. She pulled off one of her gloves and leaned forward to touch his cheek with the tip of a shaking finger. She didn't know why she wanted to touch him, but she did. The boy terrified her, but she needed to touch him, needed to know he was real and not a ghost. It felt like he needed her to touch him. She was so cold. The car moved and she heard laughter and loud talking. She tumbled into the back seat as the car took a corner too fast, and she heard a woman say, "Take it easy, Lewis." The driver replied, "It's fine, it's fine," and he gasped the engine. The baby in the seat next to her sat there, head drooping with heavy sleepiness, until his eyes closed and he slumped down. The grown-ups in the front seat kept talking, and it sounded like when her own dead mom had wine and their words got mushy. She could smell wine, bad breath, like when her own mom would kiss her goodnight. They turned another corner and the car stopped too fast, and the woman snapped at the man, and he repeated, "It's fine, it's fine." She said, "Go open the door and I'll carry the baby in." And he replied, "Let him sleep for a minute." He pawed at her chest through her coat, and she shoved at his hands and said, "Your hands are cold." But he insisted and started kissing her neck, and she moaned and let him put his hands back inside her coat. They kissed and they got out of the car laughing, and she heard the woman say, "I should get the baby." And he said, "He'll be fine for 10 minutes. "Ooh, I get 10 minutes, huh?" She fumbled in the man's pants, and he unlocked the door to the house, and they nearly fell inside. They kept laughing, and then the door slammed, and the baby woke up and began to sniffle and then started to cry. She tried to comfort him, saying, "Shh, it's okay, they'll be out in a minute." But they didn't come out, not in a minute, or in 10, or in an hour. They stayed inside, and she knew they fell asleep like Mom and Dad used to sometimes after too much wine. And she saw the baby's breath in the car, and he started to cry harder and harder, and she got more worried and tried to get out of the car, but she couldn't move. She was frozen. It was cold, so cold. And the baby cried more, and it started to lose its voice, and then its head began to bob again like he was tired, and he sobbed and looked at her with glassy, accusing eyes. She didn't want looking at her. She wanted to look away and be anywhere but in this car, but she couldn't get out. The baby boy looked at her, and his lips were turning blue, and then his head bobbed down, and he stopped crying. Everything was quiet for a long time while she watched little puffs of breath from his mouth grow smaller and less frequent until they stopped altogether. Then she blinked and was back in the front seat, reaching out to touch the blue boy's cold cheek. She drew her arm back like her hand had been burned and fell against the dash again. She started to cry harder, unable to control the hitching sobs that were building in her chest and her throat. She let them out, and it was wrong because she could get caught and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was only 9 after all, so she cried. That's a good place to stop. Bummer fiction.
Wow, dude. That is intense.
And it keeps going on. That's maybe just shy of halfway through that story.
There's a
that one
Go
messed
ahead,
with me,
Delphi.
man.
Actually, Ellen posted the other day an early review for the Fears anthology, and the reviewer mentioned my story and said, "Yeah, after reading that story, I had to put down the book and take a walk." And I'm just, yes, another one.
I also realize that it does have a supernatural aspect in it. But
It does have a slight supernatural aspect. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
but
in that
it
she
doesn't
received-
matter. That's not the point. That's not the thrust of it.
Yeah, no, the point of the story is her experience in the car in the cold with the corpse, but she gets a glimpse of how he died just so that the reader could have
Yeah, right.
a perspective on it.
There's something about there's like sort of this undefined subgenre that it really is it gets to me, like, and that's it. That story belongs to it. And it doesn't really have a name, but I'm just going to call it like the dutiful child following the parents sort of a thing that leads them down into doom.
Right.
It's like because kids are so purely trusting of their parents. So,
my favorite book is The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which is exactly in that kind of category.
Sure. Yeah.
I like thinking about stories about good people, loving people who are in terrible situations.
Mm-hmm.
That's my book, Closing Costs. It's this married couple who are in a terrible situation, and I like to divide. So many of those kind of stories, the tension is driven by conflict between the people you're supposed to sympathize with. And I like to subvert that and have the people actually really care for each other, because I think it makes the stakes larger.
It's
Very
also,
cool.
also in this subgenre, don't kill the dog, don't kill the baby.
I know. In my first novel, like in the first chapter, I kill a dog. I'm bad.
Rip that Band-Aid off.
They're never going to make a film of this or anything.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just a different level. And it's easy to feel like you're just trying to be edgy, like a bad writer would just feel like, South Park. Right. And it takes a really good writer to be able to do that kind of a thing and to be like, I'm going to throw the norms out the window and like cross that line and have it actually be not only good, but something that truly haunts the reader.
I think there has to be art to it. If you're gonna transgress like that, which for a lot of people is a huge transgression,
right?
That a lot of readers can't get over. You have to have some art to it. You have to give a reason for why you're doing it. Because just having the bad guy kill a dog to show how bad they are is bullshit.
Right.
Because you can do any number of things to show how bad somebody is without just tossing in something that's that emotional to people.
Exactly. But the way that you follow the little girl in that story is really just haunting. So congratulations on that. And does anybody else have anything to add to their feelings on Backseat other than trauma? Just general trauma.
I was going to say your co-host dropped out, so we're not.
Yeah, I know you killed Delphine. I don't know.
She had to go for a walk, I guess.
She said her internet is failing her, so she may be back. We'll see.
That's her story, and she's sticking to it.
Right. Hopefully, she'll be back in a few minutes. But does anybody have anything to add to the story?
I think I need a hug after we. I'll go get one after this is over. Dear God.
So
I'm gonna follow that.
Winter. So what season are you bringing up, Simon?
What's it?
Okay, Livia did summer and I did winter. So where are you taking us?
Well, this is winter as well, in fact. So it's equally cheerful, but no dead children.
No dead children.
Although, I mean, God, when it comes to not killing the dog, there was a scene in a novella I wrote where I killed a dog, and it wasn't the bad guy doing it; it was the main character. She'd been going through all this training and stuff, and so the final phase of the training, the final test was, can you shoot this dog? And the thing was, I based the dog on my brother-in-law's dog Chip, who is a Bedlington Terrier. Now, if you've ever seen Bedlingtons, they kind of look like little woolly lambs, but they're dogs.
Yeah.
They are the most adorable dogs in the universe. I absolutely love them. And so, of course, I'm reading this scene where she shoots the dog, and of course, it's the full horror of the fact that she's killing this poor innocent creature and didn't kill him with the first shot, of course. So my wife, who is usually the first person I read all my stuff to, was not very pleased with me. So when, as I write under the name Daniel Church as well, annoyingly, that pseudonym's been around for 2 years, and he's sold more books in those 2 years than I have in 20 odd years as Simon Bestwick, and I'm not quite sure how to feel about that. But there was a Bedlington Terrier in that as well, and I knew that dog would have to be fucking plot armor to survive the death of the universe if I had my life. And so, it's like, I don't care if the planet blows up. I don't care if all of humanity is wiped out. There has to be this little bit with an atmosphere floating around where the dog is safe and sound.
I think you get one chance to do that, and then you can't make it a part of your style, because then people know that it's not about the story. It's about about shock value or just dogs.
Then you're just chasing the dragon. You're just trying to reproduce.
Again, you
that
do
first high.
A lot of it is, you sort of, when you go to these dark places, it is kind of, you're thinking kind of, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? And which is a lot of what horror's about. Yeah. Whether it's psychological or supernatural. There's a lovely line of Nick Royals when he was talking about Ramsey Campbell's fiction, and he was talking about all the different places, in very ordinary, apparently non-threatening places where these stories take place. And his phrase was, anywhere where our imagination enables us to interpret our surroundings in terms of nightmare. And I think that's a pretty good, kind of term for horror in general. Is you looking at a situation and how can this go horribly wrong? Whether it's a monster, a ghost, or just a person, or your own sort of what's inside you. Because I think most of us are probably all capable of doing pretty horrendous things if we were ever pushed in the right direction or put in the wrong situation.
Yeah, I think most people would be Godzilla for a day if they could.
I think as well, when I was in my teens, something happened where I was put in a very terrifying, not a life-threatening situation, but one where somebody could have done something that would basically ruin my life. And just for a blip of a second, I had this very cold voice in my head, which was like, well, go kill them, dump the body. And it's a terrifying thing to, it only lasted for a second, that I was kind of horrified at myself for having thought that. But it's a scary thing when you actually realize, that's probably what happens in a lot of murders. You get somebody who would never consider themselves a bad person or a cruel person, but you put them in that situation and they just jump left instead of right, and suddenly there's a dead body, and that's truly terrifying. What people are capable of when they're frightened or when they feel backed into a corner. It's one of those things that kind of makes you, and I think it's one of the reasons why horror can often be a bit of a morally ambiguous area as well, because you're going into this thing of, yes, there are all these things we would never do, we would never do in real life or never want to do in real life, but what if we did them? What happens then? And that takes us into crime as well, into noir fiction and stuff like that. So there's this big overlap, because I love crime as well. Crime fiction, not
not the actual, actual crime.
This is why he's broadcasting for himself.
My story, and I'm sticking to it.
The Ridoctopus podcast does not endorse actual crime, just stories about
what you can't say is that the camera on his computer is just expertly positioned between the bars.
It's kind of angry.
Just off frame.
Really part of wall that doesn't have blood splatter on it. Keeping the floor out of it, with all the plastic sheeting and body parts.
So, Simon, tell us about your writing in general, and then we'll get into your story as well. What sort of things do you tend to write? What sort of themes do you come back to?
It tends to be horror, and it tends to be fairly, often. Most of it's tended to be supernatural, but I have kind of got into this thing of writing crime and thrillers. I seem to be, in terms of the books I'm banging out, I'm sort of writing. I seem to write a horror novel and then drift more towards writing something in the crime or thriller mode, which hasn't found a market yet. But I think my agent's quite impressed with the first one of them that she's seen. So hopefully something will come of that. I suspect there's more money in thrillers, which is depressing. But horror does often, especially the supernatural, gives your imagination the chance to go in all directions. But as I said, I think in a way all horror is psychological, because it's all of it is usually about what experiencing whatever it is, what effect that has on the person and how they respond to it. Two different people will see, even if it's a supernatural event, they'd respond to it in very different ways. It would change them, affect them in very different ways, because if you did see something supernatural, you're not going to be able to go on quite the way you are before. I used to be a plotter like Bracken, and I have seen the light and become a pantser.
Nice.
To the point where I got stuck on a couple of novels. I got completely stuck on what to write next, and I literally turned to my wife and said, "Give me a word," and she gave me one word, and from that an entire novel emerged, basically. So that's been a lot of fun. So I've written about seven novels under my own name, and 2 now as Daniel Church. There's The Hollows, which came out in 2022, and The Ravening, which is coming out in September this year, about 14 days after Fears, in fact.
Excellent.
Something like that.
So it's a good month.
Yeah, September is right in time for the spooky season.
Sure.
Basically. So I just like going into these kind of nightmare scenarios and letting my imagination run riot in one form or another, really.
Nice. So your story in Fears is called Bait.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little background on this one?
Yeah, this was written for, again, talking about the overlap between horror and crime or noir fiction. Maxim Jakubowski put out a submission call for an anthology called The Book of Femme Fatales and Dangerous Women, which the character in Bait certainly meets the second definition. And I did what I often do for submission calls. I tried to come up with all sorts of different high concept sort of riffs on it, got nowhere, and then just when I was about to give up hope, a very, very simple, straightforward idea. A lot of the best ideas are really simple, I find. So simply kind of like, how come I didn't think of that before? I'm kind of worried that I'm kind of now worried to check if anyone else has come up with it before, because surely it's too simple and too good an idea for them not to have done. And the rest of it was, I've been reading a lot of Gemma Files' fiction, which is always to be recommended. I think that's Spectral Evidence and We Will All Go Down Together. So I had a lot of images in my head of like Toronto in the winter kind of thing, this big, clean, quite oddly empty city with lots of snow. And so that kind of suggested itself as a setting. And the various bars that appear in the story are largely from Manchester in the north of England, where I come from. And there was one called Paddy's Goose, which is right on the edge of the gay village in Manchester. There's a very big LGBT community in that city. And I remember a publisher of mine once arranged for me and another writer to meet him there for a drink, thinking with a name like Paddy's Goose, it would be a good old-fashioned Irish bar kind of thing, not realising it was basically a big sort of drag and transvestite bar. So the barmaid was like 6'6" with these big, broadly tattooed forearms, and I just got there, and this editor and this writer was sort of sitting in a corner with slightly rabbit in the headlights expressions on their faces, which was quite entertaining. So all that kind of, it was just kind of a case of how am I going to tell the story? I'm not going to tell it from the point of view of the woman. I'm not going to tell it from the point of view of one of the bad guys. There has to be a witness, basically, and what kind of a person is in the right time and place to witness this kind of thing and comment on it. And well, that's all that is kind of becomes very clear when in Bait, basically, in the first chunk of it, which I'm going to read now.
Nice. All right. Well, take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. Late night. In a bar where you couldn't smoke anymore, but where the memory of stale tobacco hung in the air like a ghost. I was nursing a double black bush against the evil hour of having to go out into the cold, when the door flapped open and in she came, chased by a flurry of snow and a gust of bitter wind. She barely looked old enough to drink, but the barmaid didn't bother her for details like ID. Mulligan's wasn't that sort of bar, or the kind that can afford to turn away paying custom. So she served the girl, a pale slip of a thing, flower pretty and flower fragile to look at, dark-haired and white-faced, a beer, then went back to polishing glasses while the girl sat at a table and drank. With its old worn carpets, padded bench seats and faded flock wallpaper, Mulligan's isn't the kind of bar that pretty, innocent-looking girls like this one came into either, as a rule. And while my normal tendency is to mind my own business, I found myself keeping an eye on her as I nursed my drink. Some of it might have been out of a vestigial sense of chivalry or paternal instinct, but at least to start with, it was probably the kind of fascination that draws the eye to a car wreck as it happens. There were 3 or 4 other customers in the bar, none of whom I knew by name, a couple of whom I knew by sight. I had never exchanged more than a dozen words with any of them, because, altogether now, Mulligan's isn't that kind of place. You don't go there to socialise or get lucky, except maybe on the rare occasions one of the working girls from Becker's Lane comes in to warm her bones between customers. You go there to drink, and either brood on or temporarily blot out any recollection of the circumstances that had made you the kind of person who spent their nights drinking at Mulligan's. That, and occasionally you'd put something on the jukebox. They had a good selection: Pink Floyd, Sisters of Mercy, Leonard Cohen, along with the usual crowd pleasers. Just then it was playing Shine On You Crazy Diamond, all 13 or 14 minutes of it. That's what's known as value for money. The song was still on the intro, where the opening G minor chords giving way to a right slow, mournful Minimoog solo, but Gilmore hasn't come in on the guitar yet, all of which suited the mood of painless melancholy I'd been sinking into throughout the night. And then the prick in the corner had to spoil it all. He didn't do anything, not there, not then, but I'd seen him in Mulligan's a couple of times before. He wasn't big, but he was wiry, with scrubby, gingery hair and an equally scrubby ginger beard. There was an eerie stillness about him. I'd never seen him move except to drink. The rest of the time he'd just sit, staring blankly ahead, until it was time to get another vodka and coke, or to leave. Except this one time. The last time there'd been a pretty woman in the bar at the same time as him. Ginger's head had swiveled round like part of a machine, and he'd hunched forward, staring at her. It was the only time I'd seen anything resembling emotion on his face. It had looked like hunger. When the girl had gone out, maybe because his scrutiny had started to disturb her, Ginger had sat in silence for a count of 5, then got up and followed her out, leaving his drink half finished on the table. I hadn't gone after them. And I'd purposely avoided reading the papers or looking at the news for several days afterwards. I'd done my best to screen out the bar gossip, which I normally liked to eavesdrop on, but I didn't want to know. I knew enough. And while not much bothers me these days, that did. And so I wasn't surprised to see Ginger looking at the girl, the same way he had the other one. Nor was I at all surprised when, after the girl finished her beer, tapping the base of the bottle to coax the last few suds into her mouth, got up and went out. Ginger sat still for a mental count of 5 before getting up and going out too. The only surprise was the one I gave myself, when I knocked back the last of the black bush and went across the bar, pulling my parka on as I went. I had no real idea what I was going to do, beyond not letting history repeat itself, and I had even less of a clue once I made it out onto Cairn Street, because there was no one in sight, not the girl and not Ginger. A car swished by, wheels churning at the slush on the tarmac, and headlights trapping swirls of snow, but the only person in it was an old man with white hair and thick moustache. I spun first one way and then the other, but all I saw was the light shining on wet, empty pavement and grey slush. Cairn Street cuts a pretty straight line through downtown, linking 2 other main roads. There's little or nothing branching off. Other, I remembered then, than the side alleys that connect it to China Row, a narrow cobbled back street that runs behind the buildings on this side of the road, where the various businesses put out their garbage. One of those side alleys was 3 or 4 yards ahead, and now I could see what had happened very clearly, projected onto the screen at the back of my skull. Ginger coming out of Mulligan's, seeing the girl, and then accelerating after her with a cat's speed and silence. I went towards the alley, converting my normal shuffle into something like a shambling trot, and I was almost there when I heard the scream. I did the only thing I could think of and blundered down the alley onto the back street with a bellow. "Get off her, you bastard," were, I think, my exact words. Definitely something along those lines, anyway. Something that would have immediately made clear why I was there. I know that much because I left China Row alive. I caught a glimpsed blur of motion darting into the shadows, but my main focus was the small, thin body lying on the ground and the blood shining black around it in the reflected light pollution from the snow clouds above. "Fuck," I said, and then "fuck" once again. I dropped into a crouch by the body, though I could already guess from its stillness and the amount of blood that there wasn't much point. Maybe I was just glad of the excuse not to try and chase Ginger and risk serious injury even if I caught the bastard. I genuinely thought the body was her, though. I'll blame the dim light and the influence of several black bushes on that, until I flipped it over and saw who it really was. Ginger was actually still alive, if only just. His eyes were staring up at the falling snow and his lips were twitching. If I had to guess, I think he was trying to say something along the lines of, "What just happened?" A switchblade lay in the snow beside him, but there was no blood on the blade. His weapon, not hers. So I guessed I'd read his intentions correctly. There was a stab wound in his throat, but it wasn't a cut. I felt a little sick when I realized what she'd done. Her knife had both a cutting edge and a sharp point, and she'd used the point to puncture his voice box, so that after the initial scream, all he'd been able to manage were the thin, whistling sounds I finally registered he was making. As for the rest of the wounds, he'd been cut up badly, and in what could only have been seconds, given the time it had taken me to get down the alley. But I could see, too, that it hadn't been a frenzied act. Madness might or might not have been involved, but a method of some kind certainly had been. One of the wounds, for instance, ran down his right arm from the shoulder to the elbow, slicing through coat, clothing, and muscle like warmed-up butter. Bone gleamed white through the red. That would have been when he'd screamed at a guess, when she turned on him and turned the tables. Then the stab in the throat, silencing him. And then the rest of the damage. The crotch of his jeans was a sodden, ragged hole, and the source of most of the blood, although he was leaking from a couple of torso wounds too. When I looked across the alley, I could see something else lying wet and steaming in the snow. A chunk of blood-soaked denim and something else. It was too shadowy to see it in any more detail, thankfully, but lying a few inches from it was something small and egg-shaped, and I quickly looked away. A very sharp blade indeed. She'd grabbed his groin and sliced, quickly and surely, presumably, without injuring herself, then stabbed him and run. If I hadn't turned up, I suspected she'd have taken a lot more time and been considerably more inventive. What she'd done to Ginger hadn't been about self-defense. It had been punishment. Boots clicked on the cobbles down in the shadows she'd run into. I could hear the sound of cars up on Cairn Street, the hiss and swish of their tires on the road, but it seemed very distant suddenly, and China Row seemed far colder and lonelier than it usually did. She was holding 2 knives when she came out of the darkness. Both had long, thin, black triangular blades, old-style commando knives, I guessed. One glistened and dripped. I stood up and stepped back from Ginger, who let out a last whistling breath which then rattled in his ruined throat. I hadn't realized how much noise he'd been making, relatively at least, until he stopped. The alley was silent. She stood there very still. There wasn't, as far as I could see, a drop of blood on her, not counting the knife and the fingers of one preternaturally white, latex-gloved, I realized, hand. Her face was very pale, haloed by her dark hair, and utterly calm, almost like a Madonna. Dark eyes studying me. She cocked her head, lips pursed. I was a problem, not a threat, because she clearly knew how to deal with one of those, and could have caught and finished me long before I reached the alley. But a puzzle, a conundrum. I'd come to help her, after all, and I wasn't trying to run or screaming for help or cops, which, in my experience, were rarely the same thing. All that, I suppose, is why she hesitated. For a few seconds, she had as little idea as me what to do next. And so I said, "Fancy a drink?" That's it.
Love that.
Love it.
So if you get a guy if you get a British guy or gal, they always got to go last. That's just the rule.
I know. Bringing up the rear and doing all the real work while you colonials grab all the glory.
Right. I mean, like Livia appreciated you pronouncing her last name correctly. I appreciated him rolling his R when he said my first name. So,
Bracken.
Yeah.
Bracken MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod. Fantastic stuff. Ellen, what'd you love about the story?
Everything. That's why I put it first. I mean, when I choose a first story, I try to make it short, kind of figure out, show the reader where the book is going, the whole theme of it. And although up to this point it seems pretty humdrum in a way, it continues on, and that, to me, what's made it really special. And I had actually most of the writers I contacted and said, "Do you have anything?" And I had read this story originally, I guess I read it in the book where it appeared, and I remembered it. I didn't take it for the year's best, but I contacted Simon and I said, "I want this story for my psychological horror anthology." So it was one of the stories that I knew I wanted as soon as I read it and knew I was doing the anthology.
Wow.
How cool is that?
Yeah.
That's very cool.
See, we're pumping up egos too. That's what we do here at Retro Ridoctopus. Guys, everybody, we crossed the 90-minute mark, so I'm going to try to wrap it up kind of quickly, but thank you to everybody. Those stories were incredible. Amazing readings, 3 amazing readings from 3 rising masters of the genre, and all on a Sunday afternoon or evening if you're checking us out in the UK. But before we get out of here, I thought, since this is Retro Ridoctopus, we always like to swing things around to some nostalgia at the end of our Brig episodes. So I'll pose this question right now to our 4 illustrious guests and to my co-host Delphine as well, and anyone who still happens to be lurking in the live chat. The question is, we like to do these Octoponder questions. Octoponder this, guys. Name one psychological horror film that really got into your head. And
I'll start. Mine's really retro. I mean, as soon as you ask that question, it's oh shit, I haven't watched that many films, horror films, but the first thing that actually did come to my mind was a original Twilight Zone episode that I vaguely remembered, but I couldn't remember that much about it. But I was able to Google it and find out what it was. And it was the first episode in the first season called "Where Is Everybody?"
Yeah. And
I looked up. I couldn't remember. I thought I knew how it ended, but I had to find how the fuck did it end? Was it psychological? And it's like absolutely yes. And I actually think it's based on. If not based on, it's very similar to a story by J.G. Ballard. It's about this guy, Earl Holliman, who's wandering around in a town. There's no one there. He can't find anyone. He's freaking out. And I guess I can tell the end since it's like,
sure.
How is a spoiler, 50 to 60 years.
Right.
It turns out he's an astronaut testing being alone. I mean, he hit the panic button and they let him out. And he said, this is, you're going to be in space. You're not going to be with anybody. You're going to be alone for the next whatever. And this was a test. And he failed it, basically. Well, I don't know if he failed it, but, this is what it would be like. There's no one with you. And he started hallucinating that he was, walking around this town where there's absolutely no one around. And it's called Where Is Everybody? And that must have come out in the early 60s. I mean, that's when I was watching Twilight Zone, the original one.
Excellent choice. Anything Twilight Zone is 100% perfect for this this exercise.
Well, there was a lot that's supernatural, but that one was not.
That one was not.
That's very true. And then it's not.
Very true. Let's go, Delphine. Do you have an answer for this one?
I don't know how retro it is. It's over 20 years old. So does that count as being retro? Okay. Session 9 is just an amazing movie. It's one of those really slow burn things. It builds up. It's some people removing asbestos in Danvers Asylum. They actually filmed at Danvers, and there's character stuff going on between the crew and some of their relationships with home. And there's also somebody finds a recording of this girl who'd been there and all of the tapes. She has different personalities, and they're trying to find out what happens. And it's very slow burn, so if you don't do slow burn, you aren't going to enjoy it. But the last 5 minutes just gives me the heebie-jeebies. It's just wonderful. So you have good taste, Raina.
Nice.
I would highly suggest that one. Yeah.
Great choice.
The unfun fact about Session 9 is that building isn't there anymore. It's now condos. But they did keep kept the facade, the clock tower facade in the center for the front of the condo.
It gets mentioned in a few Lovecraft stories as well. I think people getting put into Danvers Asylum. I think it's in the thing in the doorstep and some of the others. It's that place basically that he's talking about.
Interesting. Livia.
Well, I mean, I would agree that Session 9 is probably my more modern pick, but of favorite psychological horror thriller movies. But going back further, a perennial love of mine. I watch it every summer when it's so hot I can barely stand it, because you'll know the second I say it. Rear Window, Hitchcock's Rear Window. Yeah. It plays into my horror of being trapped and seeing things that are horrible and that are happening, and realizing at some point you've been seen, and you can't move because the horrible thing is now coming for you. And the movie itself is just amazing. There's so many layers to it. The people's lives playing out, and who, how they all interact with each other and with and fit into the main mystery. I mean, I love all of Hitchcock's films, and I could have picked pretty much any of them. Psycho is amazing, but Rear Window is the one that truly gets me. It just it's just this little contained universe within a block of New York City. And I love that. I love how I love everything about it. I don't want to go on and on, but yes.
Yeah, it's like Paranoia the movie, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's
It's funny that you pick Rear Window, because my pick, I'm a huge Brian De Palma fan, and so my pick is his homage to Rear Window.
Dressed
which is Body Double. Right.
A what?
Which
one?
Body Double.
Oh, Body Double. Oh, Body Double.
Story about an actor who's house sitting for a friend, and he's watching. His friend has because it's sort of a sleazy LA film instead of a noirish New York film. But he's got this telescope, and he's watching this woman across the valley, and he witnesses horrible things. And the fun part of the story, what makes it such an effective homage is that he's not recovering from an injury like Jimmy Stewart. He's got crippling claustrophobia. And so anytime he's trying to solve this mystery, he's trying to figure out what actually happened. And, and there's a great scene where he's on the killer's trail and he's chasing him, and the killer runs into this little pedestrian tunnel, right, to go through a section. And he gets halfway through the tunnel and he has a panic attack because it's so close, and he feels claustrophobic. And the killer realizes that he's completely paralyzed, and comes back to him
whoa,
and it's just such a fantastic movie, and it's got this great hallucinatory scene with Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and it's just a fantastic movie. But yeah, it's the same story. It's his version of Hitchcock's Rear Window, but with Hollywood sleaze.
Well, since we're all doing Rear Windows, I guess I can't pick Fright Night, but okay. Simon, what would be yours?
Oh Lordy, what do you think? I was so sure that my first pick was going to get somebody else was going to say it, so I had I put together a short list of 3. So my first pick, my top pick was Manhunter.
I love that.
Oh yeah.
Ever. It's the original. I mean, I'm sorry, Silence of the Lambs. In terms of Hannibal Lecter's, I'm sorry, Anthony Hopkins always looks like he should be doing panto in that. I'm attacking that.
Brian Cox remains my
I was going to say Silence of the Lambs, but I decided not to. I went to something old.
Yeah, I mean, Brian Cox is just so, you almost forget what he is. He's so calm and suave and cultured and urbane. And then it's oh yeah, by the way, have you ever seen Blood in the Moonlight? Well, it appears. It's just brilliant. Plus, you've got Tom Noonan, you've got William Peterson giving one of his best performances as his sanity goes straight to the edge. And you've got the soundtrack. This is where I discovered the music of Shriekback, who went on to be one of my favourite bands.
Oh my God.
Oh my God, yeah.
What a reference.
The person who liked them. And through this, one of the great things about writing, I've discovered so many other people who are fans of theirs. And of course, In-A-Gadda Vida by Ian Butterfly is just that massive, amazing thing. My second pick, and a very close runner-up, was Cop, a James B. Harris film starring James Woods back in the days before he became a total right-wing douche nozzle, based on an early James Ellroy novel called Blood on the Moon. It's not as twisted and perverse as the James Ellroy book, because I don't think any screen adaptation of a James Ellroy book could get away with putting half of the material in the James Ellroy book onto the screen. But I mean, it's Woods was great, could be great at doing these very borderline unhinged characters, and it has one of the best, most brutal final lines in any movie. If you haven't seen it, I'm not spoiling it for you. You got to watch it. And one last honourable mention, a very little known Charles Bronson film from 1983 called 10 to Midnight, which has Brad Davis's brother Gene as a killer who murders people after stripping naked, so that there's no blood in his clothes. It's directed by J. Lee Thompson, who did The Guns of Navarone and the original Cape Fear, and that guy could really crank up tension. And the climactic sort of murder scene in that is truly edge of the seat stuff. So I've done 3 instead of 1. But
nice. No, that's fantastic.
I also did 3 because I was like, somebody else is going to do it, but they were all Brian De Palma films. I think you were expecting me to do Body Double, but Blowout.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. See, once I said, it relates to your pick, and you were like, wait, which one?
So nobody picked Fright Night. What the hell? My
stretched it to call that psychological horror.
No, yeah, I guess not. One of my favorites for this, it's like I got to go back to 1944's Gaslight, because I think it's one of the. I mean, it spawned a word that's in our zeitgeist now. It's a big movie that you like. If you haven't seen it, you should definitely go see it. It's Ingrid Bergman is the main character in it and stuff, and it's just basically the definition of being gaslit. It's the origin of that. It's really interesting, and she is just constantly being told by her brand new husband, who they met in. They had this whirlwind romance and got married after 2 weeks, but she inherited all this this house and these belongings of her rich aunt, and he keeps disappearing, and weird things are happening, and the gaslight keeps dimming at night, and she's not sure why, and she brings it up to her husband, and he's always gone, and comes back, and he's just telling her it's not real, nothing's happening, it's all in her head, and it really is this exercise in going insane, because she pretty much is cut off from everybody. He doesn't want her to have friends. He doesn't want her to, see anyone but him pretty much, but he's gone half the time, and then she's telling him these things that are happening, and he's like, no. And of course in reality, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. You find out by the end, and I don't have to ruin the whole thing, but it is a great movie. It's actually a remake of a film of the same name that came out in 1940, but the 44 one is just the better version, and it's got Ingrid Bergman, and you should just go see it. So but yeah, there's lots of great examples for sure. I've never seen Manhunter. I know.
No.
I know.
And I rectify that.
I know. I regret having come on this show.
Damn.
You have a great piece ahead of you. I envy you.
I strongly feel like Simon that Brian Cox is the best Hannibal Lecter.
Is the best Hannibal.
Followed by Mads Mikkelsen. Like Anthony Hopkins is the least good Hannibal Lecter, and he won an Oscar for it.
I still think he's great, and I
think he's pretty great, but
I think he's a great actor. I just don't think that's anywhere near his. I always loved him in the Road to Wellville as Dr. Kellogg, which was a brilliant comic performance, and that deserved a lot more recognition than Hannibal. I liked his Hannibal better when I rewatched rewatched Silence of the Lambs a few years ago, but I remember at the time, once you've seen Brian Cox, you're a bit spoiled as far as Hannibal Lecters go.
I can't take anything away from Brian Cox. He's amazing in absolutely everything. Yeah. But in defense of Hopkins, his characterization in Silence, anyway, I won't say anything about Hannibal, but in Silence, if it existed in a vacuum, I would say that what I love about his, like what you said, Simon, you said that he's just too obvious. He's obviously insane. And I would say that that's kind of what I like about it, because at that point in his life, he's just nakedly himself. There's no need to have any sort of mask on at that point. So he's already been in the insane asylum for a while, which has probably contributed to his decline as well. I'm sure when he went in, he wasn't exactly the way we met him, but I sort of dig that. I think it's really cool. And his eyes are, in my opinion, pretty unsettling.
Well, you can't see it, but off to the right, beside Simon, is a chiaroscuro drawing of the dome at the in Florence, Italy, because that's what he has instead of a view.
Oh yes, I've been in this room for 13 years now, and I know.
That's right. It's the Duomo in Florence.
But I wanted the window where I can see perhaps running water.
Excellent use of the term chiaroscuro too for all the art history buffs in the audience. My God. Well, thanks everybody.
Word sings.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. Honestly, this was a lot of fun. I hope everybody had fun watching. Before we go, I'm going to hand the mic to our guests one more time and ask where people should go to follow them, and if there's anything else you have that you'd like to mention or promote, any sort of other release or any other appearance or anything like that. Ellen.
Okay. Well, this is coming out September, whatever date we said. Got the best horror of the year's coming out in late October, I hope. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. Just Google me, and on Blue Sky. And I have a website that's not as up to date as I would like, although I blog occasionally with what's happening. I'll be at World Fantasy. I'll be in Glasgow for the World Science Fiction Convention. I'll be at Storyfest in Connecticut in the fall, and something called the Long Island something of horror that was going to be in Long Island is actually going to be on Wall Street late October because they lost the venue in Long Island. So it's some horror convention, a new one. So that's where I'm going to be and where I can be found. Blabbering on Facebook, on Twitter a lot. I argue with politicians and then mute them. Or mute their followers.
It's a growing industry.
First I mute, then I block. Right. I love muting and blocking, and then really harassing these horrible politicians. Not that they see the responses, but it makes me feel better.
It's a growing industry. We're all dabbling. Livia, where can people find you?
I mean, I'm on Facebook, and my website is horrifically out of date. I look at it every once in a while and go, whatever. I'm not on any other social media anymore. I couldn't handle it.
I can contact her for you. Give you her email.
And I'm a very, very slow writer, so I'm working on a lot of stuff. I have some things that I'm finishing up. You're not going to see any of it until next year. So it sounds very uninspiring, but I swear to God, I'm actually a writer and I'm writing.
I'm inspired. I'm sure Raina in the audience is very inspired too. She's commented a few times. So, Bracken.
I'm terminally online. I shouldn't be. You can find me on Facebook.
Agreed.
Again, being mean to mean people, and I'm also on Blue Sky, where I'm much nicer. But still mean to mean people. My latest book is Closing Costs. Like I said earlier, I'm working on a new book, which is a body horror novel about tattooing because I know nothing about that. And that's kind of me. Oh, I'll be with Ellen at Storyfest in Connecticut this October.
Be on a panel on this.
Very cool.
Hopefully.
Yep.
Very cool.
About fears. Or psychological horror.
And if anybody hasn't read it, go read Bracken's novel "Come to Dust." It's great.
Oh, thank you. I'm very fond of that one. Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. Simon.
Yeah, well, I'm online both as Simon Bestwick and as Daniel Church. My identity crisis is spread out across the internet. You can find both versions of me on Facebook and on Twitter, whatever. By its dead name. If it's good enough for Elon, it's good enough for me. I've just started on Instagram as Danny the Church under my other identity. I've got a blog as Simon Bestwick, and I've got a website as Daniel Church, which has got this ridiculously convoluted name because I haven't bought a proper domain name yet. But you can find stuff there.
It's coming.
Do not mix me up, the Daniel Church up with this. There's a writer called another Daniel Church who's written a thriller called Winter Games, which is some kind of climate change denial bullshit. Please do not mix me up with this guy. It's my nightmare. I'm going to get cancelled on social media because somebody thinks I'm a climate change denial.
I ordered that on Amazon during your reading. Damn it.
And here is and my new book. So I had to whip that because I love this cover by Sarah O'Flaherty, The Ravening, and that's
nice.
out on September
Ooh, I like
24th. And as you can see, it looks absolutely.
Who's the publisher?
That's Angry Robot. Angry Robot, and that's coming out.
Oh, nice.
Byline.
Very cool.
It smells lovely.
Wait, sir, what you need is you need to get yourself a middle initial. That's what you need. Daniel G. Church or something.
Daniel T. Church. You know, maybe I'm Danny the Church on most of my social media handles. So
oh, Daniel T. Daniel T. Church.
Yeah.
It stands for Theodora.
Yeah. You know, go for the best middle initial ever, which is H, right?
Daniel H. Church.
Yeah. Jesus H. Christ, Daniel H. Church.
Yes.
That could work.
By the way, before we go, can I ask you for one favor, Simon?
Mm-hmm.
Say my name again.
Bracken MacLeod.
Yes.
All right, that's going in the Rolodex for later. I don't know what you've done. You don't feed him like that. Don't feed him like that.
Make it your ringtone.
I'll record it as an audio clip and message it to you on Facebook.
Whatever happens off the show, I know nothing about it. It's fine. Delphine, please tell everybody where they can watch you and what shows you're on again.
Oh God. Look for me on Facebook at Carrie, Kari Sanders. If you see a crow, that's me. All my information is there. My author page, my Owlite stuff for the Owlite Network, Splash Pages stuff when I do the comic book show on Tuesdays. I just have a lot, and there's a gal named Jenny who is awesome. She's our Girl Friday for the network, and she handles all of my social media except for my main page. So if you actually try to get in touch with me, she'll let me know. You should get one, Livia. Jenny's are great. She's the best. And
get a Jenny.
I'm also yes, I'm also contracted by the Owlite Network to say at least once when I'm in his presence, Steve Van Samson. Because of some very strange things going on. So Bracken, you're the only one who has a name thing.
There's no contract.
Steve, from now on, he's going to be Steve of Destruction to me.
Thank you. Finally, somebody called me that. I've been floating that for like 6 years. Nobody calls me that.
Steve of Destruction, man, how you doing?
I will answer to that every time. Trust me.
Steve, where do you want us to find you?
Find me on Retro Ridoctopus. Find me on Facebook. Find me on Blue Sky. I am most active on Facebook in general. I have an author page and a personal page, and we have a great group with Retro Ridoctopus. Lots of people. Very positive place. I'm pretty proud. We've kept it a very safe space for 6 years now. It's never kind of become inundated with crap, and we've worked really hard at that. And there are very specific rules for, like, just treating everybody with respect, and it's a great geeky place to come and hang out and see about what podcasts we got coming out, like this episode of The Brig and all sorts of stuff. So, guys, if you're still there, get your butts over to tachyonpublications.com and pre-order your copy of Fears, Tales of Psychological Horror right now. Like, seriously, just stop what you're doing and just go there and do that now so you don't forget. The book comes out on September 10th, and it features stories from our fabulous 4 guests, as well as various award-winning authors like Josh Mallerman, Laird Barron, Haley Piper, who was going to be here tonight and ended up tapping out, and Stephen Graham Jones, and so many more. And for those who have staunchly followed Retro Ridoctopus over the years, I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself and my usual co-hosts, 8-Bit Alchemy, Nintendo, Coopster Gold, and all the Retroids who make our face group the fun-filled den of geeky positivity it is on a daily basis. On this, our 50th episode of The Brig, I still can't believe it. You guys all get a hearty shabibin, which is our favorite fake word that we made up, and we just throw that around. Shabibin! It feels good. And to our special crow host of the moment, Delphine, thank you so much for helping with this titanic endeavor that was the Fears of Ellen Datlow. Could not have done this without you. Round of applause, Delphine. Thank you so much.
Sorry about my internet.
Guys, that's the show. If you haven't jumped ship by now, we certainly hope you've enjoyed this week's journey over the treacherous waters of all the things that made growing up awesome. If you've liked what you've seen and / heard, please hit up our popular Facebook group and subscribe to the show on your podcast app of choice. I have been your host, Steve, a.k.a. Steve of Destruction, a.k.a. Steve Van Sampson. And it is a sad thing that your adventures have ended here. Good night.